December 7th, 1941, the Japanese Navy struck Pearl Harbor without warning. For the three Mott brothers of New Jersey, the day marked the beginning of a long war. Benny Mott, an anti-aircraft officer on the USS Enterprise, watched the attack unfold as his carrier raced back to port. The ship's battle flag was already flying, a stark symbol of the coming conflict. That same morning in the Philippines, the youngest brother, Ensign Barton Cross, was wounded in the bombing of Cavite Navy Yard. He was taken to Sternberg Hospital, where he would be captured by Japanese forces 2 weeks later. The third brother, Bill Mott, was a lieutenant commander in Washington, unaware of Barton's fate. But for now, he lay in a hospital bed, a prisoner of the rising sun. In April 1942, while Benny Mott helped launch the Doolittle raid from Enterprise, with her battle flag snapping in the wind, Bill Mott took up a new post in the White House basement. He was ordered to create a secret map room to keep President Roosevelt informed of the war. From that room, Bill began a desperate search for his missing brother. The Battle of Midway in June 1942. Benny Mott served aboard Enterprise as American dive bombers sank 4 Japanese carriers, turning the tide of war. Meanwhile, in the Philippines, Barton was transferred to Cabanatuan prison camp. There he joined other American captives, including a fellow ensign named Charles Armour. The two would endure together for years to come. In October 1942, the war in the Pacific reached a tipping point. Benny Mott stood in sky control aboard USS Enterprise as Japanese carrier planes swarmed toward the American fleet. The Battle of Santa Cruz was about to begin. Enterprise took 3 direct bomb hits that morning. Fires erupted across the flight deck, and the ship shuddered under the impact. Through it all, Benny kept his anti-aircraft guns firing, watching Japanese planes fall in flames only to be replaced by more. The carrier survived, but at a terrible cost. Hundreds of sailors died that day, and Enterprise limped back to Pearl Harbor for repairs that would take months. Meanwhile, thousands of miles to the southwest, Barton Cross and Charles Armour were being transferred from Cabanatuan to a new prison camp on the island of Mindanao. The Davao Penal Colony was a sprawling facility surrounded by jungle and guarded by men who answered to the Kempeitai. Barton carried with him a worn baseball glove, a gift from a fellow prisoner who had smuggled it into camp. It was a small piece of home in a world that had none left. The Davao Penal Colony offered one thing Cabanatuan never had: room to breathe. Prisoners were put to work in the surrounding fields, planting rice and vegetables under the hot Philippine sun. Barton organized baseball games in the evenings, using that old glove to teach the game to men who had never played. Charles Armour watched from the sidelines, still carrying the hat full of recipes he had collected at Cabanatuan. The games became a ritual, a brief hour when men could pretend they were not prisoners. The Japanese guards allowed it, perhaps recognizing that a tired prisoner was a manageable prisoner. For Barton, the baseball diamond was a kind of sanctuary. He pitched, he batted, he laughed, and for a few hours each day the hunger and the fear receded. But the war was not finished with them yet. In April 1943, 10 American prisoners slipped past the barbed wire and disappeared into the Mindanao jungle. They had been planning the escape for months, gathering supplies, bribing guards, and waiting for the right night. Barton knew about the plan. The escape leaders had come to him, asking if he would join them. He said no. His reason was simple. The Japanese had made it clear that for every prisoner who escaped, 10 would be shot. He could not live with that blood on his hands. On the night of April 4th, the 10 men made their break. They had help from Filipino guerrillas waiting in the jungle, and within days they were miles from the camp. Back at Davao, the Japanese guards erupted in fury. Roll calls were held at gunpoint. Prisoners were beaten, starved, and confined to their barracks. Barton and Charles pressed themselves into the corners of their hut, keeping their heads down and their mouths shut. The reprisals lasted for weeks. Food rations were cut in half. Men were forced to stand for hours in the blazing sun, hands tied behind their backs. The guards singled out the leaders, those they suspected of knowing about the escape. Barton was not among them, but he watched as friends were dragged away, beaten with bamboo poles, and thrown into solitary confinement. Charles Armour grew thinner, his beriberi worsening with each passing week. Barton shared his own food with him, spooning rice into his friend's mouth when Charles was too weak to lift his hands. The baseball glove sat untouched in the corner of the hut. There was no energy for games, no spirit for laughter. The men were surviving on the edge of endurance, and yet they survived. Barton's optimism, worn thin as it was, never quite died. He began singing hymns in the evenings, a low, clear tenor that carried through the dark hut. Other men joined in. It was not defiance. It was simply the sound of men refusing to surrender. In August 1943, while Barton and Charles were enduring the aftermath of the Davao escape, a different battle was being fought in a grand hotel in Quebec, Canada. President Franklin D. Roosevelt and Prime Minister Winston Churchill were meeting for the Quadrant Conference, planning the next phase of the war. At that conference, a man named Major William Dias took the podium. Dias was a major in the Army Air Corps who had escaped from the Davao Penal colony. He had made his way back to the United States carrying a story that shocked even the most hardened military leaders. In a sworn affidavit, Dias described the Bataan Death March, the starvation diets, the beheadings, and the systematic cruelty of the Japanese prison camps. Roosevelt listened in silence. Churchill sat motionless. The affidavit was read aloud, and the room seemed to grow colder with each word. Back in New Jersey, Helen Cross read the newspaper accounts of the Dias revelations with growing horror. She knew her son Barton was somewhere in the Philippines. She did not know if he was alive or dead, but she knew one thing. The American military was bombing Japanese supply ships that might be carrying American prisoners. In August 1943, she sat down at her typewriter and composed a letter to President Roosevelt. She urged him to warn the Navy to be more careful, to mark prisoner transports, to do something to protect men who had already suffered so much. The letter found its way to the White House, and Roosevelt forwarded it to the War Department with a note of his own. But out in the Pacific, the Navy had no way of knowing which Japanese ships held prisoners. They were targets, all of them, and Helen Cross could only wait. In November 1943, a plan was set in motion to rescue the prisoners at Davao. Major Harold Rosenquist of MISX, the Army's secret escape and evasion unit, had spent months developing a scheme to extract the men by submarine. The plan was bold, carefully detailed, and had the approval of General MacArthur's Chief of Staff. Rosenquist was ready to board a submarine for the Philippines when he encountered a wall of resistance. Colonel Courtney Whitney, the head of the Philippine Regional Section, blocked him at every turn. Whitney was a lawyer who had worked for MacArthur before the war, and he had his own vision for the Philippines. He believed the guerrilla network was more valuable than a handful of prisoners. He argued that a rescue attempt would compromise intelligence operations. He insisted on delays, further study, and more approvals. Rosenquist was held in Brisbane for weeks, then months, while Whitney's bureaucracy ground the operation to a halt. By the time Rosenquist finally reached Mindanao in early 1944, it was too late. The prisoners at Davao had been moved, shipped out to other camps in the Philippines and Japan. The rescue mission had failed before it began. Rosenquist was devastated. He had promised those men that help was coming, and he had not been able to deliver. Back at Davao, Barton and Charles never knew how close rescue had come. They only knew that one day they were loaded onto a ship and taken to a new camp, deeper into occupied territory. The baseball glove went with them, tucked into Barton's pack. The songs continued, the hope, frayed and battered, held on by a thread, but time was running out. January 1944, Lieutenant Commander Bill Mott stepped onto the deck of the USS Rocky Mount, a command ship bristling with antennae and radar arrays. He had come a long way from the quiet corridors of the White House map room. Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, the formidable commander of the amphibious forces, had personally requested Mott as his flag secretary. The assignment placed Mott at the nerve center of the Pacific Island hopping campaign. His first test came in February when the Rocky Mount anchored off Kwajalein Atoll, and Mott watched the awesome spectacle of massed naval firepower pulverizing a tiny coral island. The invasion went smoothly, the first successful test of the new amphibious doctrine. But Mott knew the easy ones were behind them. In the flag plot compartment below the bridge, Mott studied the charts of the next objective, the Mariana Islands. The Rocky Mount's keel vibrated constantly as landing craft churned past, carrying Marines toward beaches that would soon be soaked in blood. Mott's job was to keep Admiral Turner informed, to distill the chaos of battle into clean, actionable reports. He worked 18-hour days, his eyes burning from fatigue, but he never stopped thinking about his brother Barton, still a prisoner somewhere in the Philippines. Every time a casualty list crossed his desk, he scanned it for the name Cross, and every time it was not there, he felt a small, guilty relief. June 15, 1944, the invasion of Saipan began under a gray sky that smelled of cordite and wet earth. Mott stood on the Rocky Mounts Bridge as wave after wave of Marines hit the beaches. The Japanese defenders had learned from earlier defeats. They stayed in their caves and waited, then opened fire at close range. Casualties mounted on the black sand, far worse than Kwajalein. Mott saw it all through binoculars, bodies crumpling, Amtraks burning, the wounded being dragged back to the surf. The cost of taking one island was measured in thousands of young men who would never go home. The Saipan campaign exposed a deep fracture in the Allied command. Marine General Holland Smith, frustrated by the slow advance of the Army's 27th Division, relieved its commander, General Ralph Smith, in the middle of the battle. The decision sparked a bitter inter-service feud that echoed all the way to Washington. Mott, working in the flag plot, heard the angry radio exchanges. He understood that the Army and the Marines fought differently, but on a narrow island with no room for maneuver, there was only one way to take ground. You had to take it yard by yard, and the price was always paid in blood. September 1944, the war had moved west, and the prisoners at Cabanatuan camp in Luzon could hear the distant rumble of American bombers. Barton Cross and Charles Armour had been transferred from Davao back to Cabanatuan in July, reunited with the rest of the Ensign fraternity in the same sprawling compound where their captivity had begun. Their rations had shrunk to a handful of rice a day. Their bodies were skeletal, but on the morning of September 21st, the sky filled with American carrier planes, and the prisoners pressed their faces against the barred windows, cheering until they were hoarse. For a few hours, they believed that rescue was finally at hand. Then the planes vanished, and the silence returned. At the same time, Lieutenant Commander Bill Mott, now serving on Admiral Turner's staff in the Philippines, received a grim report. The submarine USS Paddle had torpedoed a Japanese transport, the Enoura Maru, off the coast of Mindanao. It was carrying American prisoners. Most of the men aboard had been killed. Mott felt the news like a physical blow. He did not know if Barton was on that ship, but he knew that the Navy could not tell the difference between a troop transport and a prisoner ship. The Japanese never marked them. The Americans fired on anything that moved. Barton could be alive 1 minute and gone the next, and no one would know. October 20th, 1944. General Douglas MacArthur waded ashore at Leyte, cameras rolling, jaw set in triumph. The return to the Philippines had begun. Aboard the USS Enterprise, Benny Mott's anti-aircraft crew scanned the skies for kamikazes, the new suicide weapon that had already claimed several ships off Leyte Gulf. The Japanese were throwing everything they had at the invasion fleet, and the fighting was vicious. But for the prisoners at Bilibid, the news of MacArthur's landing sparked a frantic hope. They had been abandoned once before, in 1942, when the Army evacuated only its own patients from Sternberg Hospital. Would it happen again? In New Jersey, Helen Cross tended her garden and listened to the radio. She had written to President Roosevelt a year earlier, pleading with him to protect the prisoners. She had received a polite reply, but nothing had changed. Now, with MacArthur on Leyte, she allowed herself to believe her son might come home. She did not know that the Japanese had already made their decision. They would evacuate the prisoners to Japan on the next available ship before the Americans could reach Manila. A typhoon was brewing, and the Japanese were waiting for the air raids to stop. The moment the skies cleared, they would load the prisoners onto the Oryoko Maru. The last voyage was about to begin. December 13, 1944, the typhoon that had grounded American planes for 2 weeks finally passed. At Bilibid Prison in Manila, guards rousted the prisoners before dawn. 1,619 men, officers, chaplains, doctors, formed into columns of 4. Barton Cross and Charles Armour were among them. They marched through the ruined streets of Manila toward Pier 7, past the gutted shell of the Manila Hotel, past the Army and Navy Club where Barton had spent his last night of freedom 3 years earlier. At the pier, the Oryoko Maru loomed above them. She was a handsome liner, with parlors and cabins on every deck, but those cabins were already crammed with Japanese women and children fleeing the fall of the Philippines. The prisoners were herded into the cargo holds instead. In the forward hold, Barton and Charles wedged themselves against the bulkhead as more men were pushed in behind them. Guards used shovels and bamboo poles to pack the space so tight that men sat with their knees drawn to their chests, unable to move. The temperature in the hold reached 120 degrees. Men licked moisture from the wooden shelves, then from each other's skin. Latrine buckets overflowed and the deck became a shallow bath of human waste. By midnight, the first prisoners began to go mad, screaming, fighting, clawing at their own throats. Barton and Charles paired up with Earl Ferguson and Robert Granston, hanging back in the rear recesses of the shelving as chaos spread around them in the pitch dark. At dawn on December 15th, the ship's air raid alarm howled Commander Robert Riera's Air Group 11 from the USS Hornet dove out of the morning sky. 8 Hellcats peeled into steep dives, dropping bombs and rockets on the convoy creeping along the Bataan coast. One bomb ripped a jagged hole in the side of Oryoko Maru, letting in light and air. Then the strafing began. 50 caliber bullets raked the decks, killing Japanese gunners and prisoners alike. The ship was crippled, rudder broken, hull punctured in a dozen places. By nightfall, Oryoko Maru limped into Subic Bay. The next morning, Japanese guards ordered the prisoners to abandon ship. They were told to remove their clothes and shoes and swim for shore. Charles Armour could not swim. Barton secured him under one arm and paddled the quarter-mile to the beach with the other. When their feet touched sand, Barton turned back into the water to help struggling fellow prisoners. The survivors were herded onto a tennis court at the old U.S. Naval Base at Olongapo. They spent 5 days there under the tropical sun, with no shelter and no food except uncooked rice kernels tossed through the fence. A single trickling spigot provided water. Barton made trip after trip to that spigot, filling his canteen and passing it around to the other ensigns. At night, the temperature dropped and men huddled together shivering, their sunburned skin turning to gooseflesh on the cold concrete. On Christmas Eve, the prisoners were loaded onto boxcars and transported north to Lingayen Gulf. There, on December 27th, they were ordered onto 2 waiting freighters, the Enoura Maru and the Brazil Maru. Barton and Charles, with most of the ensigns, boarded the Enoura Maru. The hold was covered in fresh horse manure from a recent cavalry transport. Men lay down in the filth, too exhausted to care, picking grains of millet and oats from the dung to eat. On January 9th, as breakfast was being distributed, the air raid sirens screamed again, the same American squadron from the Hornet. The bombs struck the forward hold and engine room directly. A near miss shredded the starboard hull, sending steel splinters spraying through the prisoners. Barton was struck in the head by a fragment. The wound was small, hidden by his thick, matted hair, but it would prove fatal. He also contracted acute enteritis from the contaminated conditions in the hold. The carnage was staggering. 400 prisoners were killed outright. Hundreds more were wounded, trapped under fallen beams. Father Cummings, the Catholic chaplain, began to pray the Lord's Prayer aloud. The men joined him, voices rising from the smoky darkness. A chunk of shrapnel from that bomb, jagged, still warm, the size of a man's hand, lay on the deck where it had landed, a piece of the violence that had torn through them. Another fragment, smaller, had already buried itself in Barton's skull, though no one in the hold knew it yet. 2 days later, Japanese working parties began winching the dead out of the hold in cargo nets. On January 14th, the survivors were transferred from the crippled Enoura Maru back to the Brazil Maru. The ship sailed north into the coldest Asian winter in 40 years. Icy drafts howled through the hold as the ship reached cruising speed. Men began to die by the hour, 20, then 30, then 40 a day. Their bodies were stripped for clothing, piled in the passageway, and thrown overboard each morning. Barton was too weak to stand now. He had paired with Robert Granston, a fellow ensign from the University of Seattle. They formed a survival pact, dividing every morsel of food and every sip of water equally. Granston would raise Barton's head, open his mouth, and spoon in the tiny portions. When Barton drifted in and out of consciousness, Granston kept him alive by sheer force of will, sharing stories of their families, Barton describing lilac hedges, Granston painting pictures of his family farm outside Seattle. By the last week of January, Barton could no longer speak. Dysentery, pneumonia, and the undetected head wound joined forces with starvation and exposure to immobilize him. Father Cummings had died too, his voice finally silenced after weeks of offering evening prayers. The chaplain's last whispered words, "Eternal rest grant unto them, O Lord, and let perpetual light shine upon them," still echoed in the darkness as men slipped away one by one. On January 30th, the Brazil Maru docked at Moji, Japan. 500 survivors of the original 1,619 prisoners queued up to debark. The incapacitated were carried off first and laid on the cold wooden dock. Charles Armour, stooped and grunting under the weight, carried Barton down the gangplank and lowered him gently onto the platform. He sat beside him, waiting for the Japanese medical examiners to begin their assessments. Charles watched his friend's chest rise and fall, grateful for every breath. He closed the top button of the Japanese overcoat that Robert Granston had put on Barton and pulled the collar up around his ears. As if in response to Charles's presence, Barton inhaled deeply and released a long, encouraging sigh. Then there were no more breaths. Charles looked on in disbelief as the Japanese medical examiner crouched down, felt for a pulse on Barton's wrist, then on his neck, and then turned the body over to examine the back of the head. The voyage from Manila to Moji had lasted 49 days. Of the 1,619 prisoners who boarded the Oryoko Maru on December 13th, only 450 arrived alive in Japan. Of those, 161 would die in labor camps in the weeks that followed. The Japanese medical examiner's report, recorded but never translated, noted 2 causes: acute enteritis and a bomb wound to the head. Barton Cross had survived 3 years of captivity, the bombing of Cavite, the Bataan campaign, the prison camps at Cabanatuan and Davao, only to be killed by his own countrymen on the final day of his journey to Japan. March 17, 1945, Lieutenant Commander Bill Mott stepped onto the debris-littered pier at Manila. The city was in ruins, and the stench of rotting flesh hung over the harbor. He had finally received permission from Admiral Turner to search for his brother. At Bilibid Prison, a clerk handed him a stack of prisoner transport manifests. Bill's finger traced down the list until he stopped at a single line. Cross, Arthur Barton, Jr., Ensign, USNR. The ship was the Oryoko Maru, and it had departed Manila on December 13, 1944, the last prisoner transport to escape before the Americans sealed the bay. Bill learned that Barton had survived the sinking in Subic Bay. His name was not on the casualty list for that ship, but what followed was a trail of loose threads and bureaucratic silence. The Japanese had moved surviving prisoners north, first to Formosa, then to Japan itself. The records were fragmentary, scattered across dozens of camps and ships, each one a potential dead end. Bill left Bilibid with more questions than answers, carrying the Oryoko Maru manifest like a talisman. April 13, 1945, the USS El Dorado lay off Okinawa as wave after wave of kamikaze planes screamed out of the morning sky. Bill Mott stood in the Combat Information Center, monitoring radar reports and relaying damage updates to Admiral Turner. The fleet was taking losses, 5 ships sunk in 2 days, hundreds of sailors dead. The strain on Turner was visible, the Admiral's back pain flared, and his temper grew shorter with each passing hour. By July, intelligence reports revealed a staggering truth. Japanese forces on Kyushu had tripled in strength. The planned invasion of Japan, Operation Olympic, would face a defending army of nearly 1 million men and thousands of suicide aircraft. Admiral Turner calculated the likely cost: 600,000 American casualties. He summoned Bill Mott. "You worked in the White House," Turner said. "Get these estimates to President Truman." Bill boarded a transport for Washington, carrying the most critical document of his military career. September 25, 1945, at Lilac Hedges in New Jersey. Helen Cross sorted through the afternoon mail. One envelope bore the return address of the Navy Department. She opened it with trembling hands. The letter informed her that Barton had died of acute enteritis on January 30th, 1945, aboard a Japanese transport ship. He had been dead 8 months. Helen sat down on the porch steps and wept. The letter crumpled in her lap, but Helen Cross did not accept the official story. She wrote to President Truman, to the Navy Department, to anyone she thought might listen. She demanded the names of survivors who had known her son. In the weeks that followed, letters began arriving from military hospitals across the country, from Charles Armour, from Robert Granston, from Kenneth Wheeler. They described Barton's courage, his generosity, his refusal to abandon hope. "He never complained," wrote one. "He was cheerful and courageous until the end." Another said, "In all those 3 years under humiliating conditions, Bart was ever the gentleman, a true inspiration to all who knew him. The full truth of Barton's death would not be known to the family for decades." It was not until 2009, when a never-translated Japanese medical record was uncovered in Barton's personnel file, that the official cause was clarified: acute enteritis and death from bomb wound to head. The bomb fragment that killed Barton had come from an American aircraft. Helen Cross had been right all along. In the spring of 1949, Bill Mott traveled to Yokohama and stood before a marble columbarium in the British Commonwealth War Cemetery. He found Barton's name etched into the stone wall alongside 332 others who had died on the hellships. The Purple Heart Medal that had been awarded to Barton and angrily returned by Helen was quietly filed away in government archives. But Bill carried something else away from that visit, a resolve to ensure that no American prisoner would ever again suffer as his brother had. After the war, Charles Armour returned to Arkansas, married a nurse he met at the Naval Hospital, and died of a heart attack in 1953. Robert Granston recovered his health, married his high school sweetheart, and built a career in the Navy, retiring as a captain. Bill Mott rose to become the Navy's 21st Judge Advocate General, where he helped draft stronger protections for prisoners of war in the revised Geneva Convention. Benny Mott devoted his post-war years to preserving the memory of the USS Enterprise and the men who served on her. William Dias, whose testimony had awakened the nation to Japanese atrocities, died in a plane crash in December 1943, just weeks after his story was published. Harold Rosenquist, his rescue mission thwarted by bureaucratic delays, was awarded the Legion of Merit for his intelligence work behind enemy lines. If you have family memories, letters, or photographs from World War II, especially stories of the prisoners of war in the Pacific, we would be honored to hear them in the comments below. Please take a moment to subscribe to this channel and give the video a like. Your support helps us continue telling these essential stories. Thank you for listening and for remembering.